Hello, APUSH people. I hope this video finds you well. This is Mr. Laubach. In this video, we are going to go over Western expansion, and this corresponds with Chapter 16 of the textbook titled Conquering the West. In this video, I will go over the United States' changing relationship with Asia during this time period, why people migrated west, the results and impacts of Western expansion, the Indian Wars, and the effects of the Indian Wars. Before we take a look at expansion into the western part of the continent, let's look at America's changing relationship with Asia. The U.S. sought to trade beyond its border as an extension of Manifest Destiny. The Treaty of Kanawha was an 1854 agreement between the United States and the government of Japan. In what became known as, quote, the opening of Japan, the two countries agreed to engage in limited trade. Importantly, this allowed U.S. ships to refuel in the Japanese islands, making it much easier to take the long journey from the far reaches of the Pacific back to the U.S. mainland. The Burlingame Treaty was signed in 1868, and it outlined a friendly relationship between China and the United States. The Burlingame Treaty gave both China and the United States rights to move freely in each other's respective countries. It also allowed Chinese immigrants to go to the United States without restriction. What were the reasons that people migrated west during the second half of the 1800s? It is very important to keep in mind that the American government not only encouraged expansion west, but they also incentivized it in many ways. A big reason for the push west was the Transcontinental Railroad. The Pacific Railway Act encouraged the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. This was passed, of course, during the Civil War. Many of the people that worked on the railroad were Irish immigrants that worked headed west from the east, and Chinese immigrants who worked headed east from the west. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed on May 10th of 1869, where it met in Promontory Summit in Utah, officially connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. It was now possible to travel from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States in about a week. Not only could people travel quickly, so could goods and ideas. Now the United States truly had a national economy. There actually ended up being 4 transcontinental railroads when all's said and done. Homestead Act is where the federal government would give away 160 acres to anyone that wanted it. This was man, woman, black, white. It did not matter. It was given away for a minimal, basically a filing fee. And as long as you improved the land and lived there for 5 years, it would then be yours. This act was enacted during the Civil War. Now, the problem with this was that the land that was given was not very good, and 160 acres in this region really was not enough land to farm and make money to live. Many Americans also called this land the Great American Desert because of the lack of water and rain. Most of these homesteaders, unfortunately, ended up not being very successful, and many of them headed back east. And much of the good land was given to the wealthy through corruption and also given to the railroads. Exodusters, these were freed men and women that moved west. Exodusters was the name given to African Americans who left the South and headed west to escape the very oppressive discrimination and black codes of the South. Rain follows the plows was the unfounded theory that settlement in the Great Plains or the Great American Desert caused an increase in rainfall. This simply was not the case, but this encouraged a lot of people to move west. The Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 set aside federal lands to create colleges to, quote, benefit the agricultural and mechanical arts. Many of the colleges today in the United States are a result of the Morrill Land Grant College Act. A great example of this would be Penn State and the University of Delaware. Another big reason people moved west was because of mineral resources. Comstock Lode in present-day Virginia City, Nevada, was a site of a silver and gold rush, also named after Henry Comstock, who was the founder. Of course, earlier there was the California Gold Rush. There was also Pikes Peak in Colorado, where gold was discovered. Mining towns attracted a diverse and combustible mix of white, black, Indian, Mexican, and Chinese miners, and were oftentimes wild, unregulated areas that were often on the verge of anarchy. This is where the term the Wild West comes from. Most miners had gone in the hopes of getting rich, but unfortunately, many of them did not. The hope was to get there, get rich, and head back east. But this rarely ever happened. And many miners were stuck in the West because they lost all they had and couldn't afford to get back east. So there were a lot of people in these mining towns that were really down on their luck. Because of mining and railroads, new communities were created in the West, and they became centers for commercial activity. These towns were often referred to as boom towns. These towns were often filled with half foreign-born population. So a big myth of the West at the time was that it was not diverse at all, when in fact there was a lot of diversity to similar levels in the urban areas in the East. The cattle industry drove many people west. These people were oftentimes referred to as cowboys. It was relatively cheap to get into and attracted many blacks from the South. Many Civil War veterans took to the open plains as well for their opportunity. The long drive was the name given to the process of these cowboys herding the cattle from the open plains to the railroads where they would make their money. The prices for cattle meat was very high in the East, and cattle was a very lucrative business. The conditions for these cattle in this region were perfect, and railroads opened up all types of new markets. So again, this is connected to the Transcontinental Railroad. The cattle industry was very volatile, though. Bad weather, overgrazing, ranchers beginning to put barbed wire, invented by Joseph Glidden to protect their property, and the fluctuating markets created much of this volatility. As I mentioned earlier, there was actually a lot of diversity in the cattle industry. Not just whites, but there were blacks, there were Mexicans, and a lot of immigrants would leave the East Coast or the West Coast and head to the interiors to take part in the cattle industry. Now, what were some of the impacts or results of this Western expansion? About 250,000 Indians called the Great Plains home. They were thriving, leading nomadic lifestyles as superb hunters chasing the millions of buffalo they used for a variety of purposes. However, the buffalo population was drastically decreasing. This really affected Native American tribes as they were dependent on buffalo for food, clothing, shelter, and tools. This dramatic decrease in population was due to white settlers hunting them for fun or for their meat or for their hide, and also to make room for the growing network of railroads. The farming industry in the United States was changing drastically. As mechanization and technology improvements were made, farming almost took on an industrial type of a nature. This basically ended up forcing smaller farmers to leave agriculture. The small yeoman farmers were not as common as they were prior to the Civil War, and the small-time farmer really struggled during this time period, especially in the western part of the United States. Some common problems facing farmers were falling crop prices due to the expanded amount of supply because of this industrialized farming, unfair railroad business practices, which we will learn more about later, high costs of this new machinery and technology. So while this machinery did make farming a lot easier, and this technology did, it was also very expensive. High tariffs as well. We'll talk more about all of these a little bit later. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 suspended Chinese immigration for 10 years and declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization. Meant to curb the influx of Chinese immigrants to the United States, particularly in California, the Chinese Exclusion Act marked the first law enacted to exclude a specific ethnic or racial group from immigrating to the U.S. The environmental impacts of unchecked mining led to environmental destruction, especially with the use of hydraulic mining techniques. Also, Native Americans lost much of the land that they had for decades been relegated to by being pushed west. And the land that they were given was not nearly as good as the land they were forced to give up. Now, with Western expansion, Native Americans and the U.S. government had many conflicts. These were known collectively as the Indian Wars. Many of the soldiers and troops that fought in the Civil War after the war were sent out west to participate in these Indian Wars. Keep in mind that the U.S. government promoted a policy of assimilation of Native Americans. In other words, they wanted to Americanize and civilize them. They did not want them to maintain their autonomy and their way of life. So some of the major incidents of the Indian Wars, you had the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where over 100 Native Americans were killed in Colorado. The Fetterman Massacre was a battle during Red Cloud's War in 1866 between a confederation of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes versus a detachment of the United States Army based in Fort Phil Kearny, Wyoming. The U.S. military's mission here was to protect the travelers on the Bozeman Trail. This confederation was led by many leaders of the Native Americans, including Crazy Horse. The Lakota Alliance emerged victorious, and the remaining U.S. forces withdrew from the area. The Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, where General Custer and his men were all killed by Native Americans. This took place in 1886. The Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890 wasn't really a battle and was more of a massacre in which 300 Native Americans, including many women and children, were killed. This was seen as the last major incident of the Indian Wars. The battle basically signified the end of the autonomy of the Native American people in this part of the United States, and the remaining were moved to reservations and basically lost their sovereignty. So what were the results of the conflicts between the whites and the Native Americans? One of the results was the Dawes-Sovereignty Act of 1887, which dramatically changed life for the Indians as it gave their Native American land to the white settlers. Native Americans could get citizenship, but it also required them to abandon their nomadic lifestyle, and they had to take up Christianity. Now, in response to this, Native Americans began practicing the ghost dance, and this became known as the ghost dance movement. These were ceremonies in which Native Americans would envision a return of the bison and an elimination of whites from their land. This, in turn, created great concern by the American government. Indian boarding schools attempted to assimilate Native Americans. Now, in many cases, Native American children would be sent to these boarding schools. A great example of this boarding school would be the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. And they would be taught to speak English, live the American way of life, dress like a white American, and they would attempt to, quote, kill the Indian, but save the man. Needless to say, these Indian boarding schools were very oppressive towards traditional Native American ways of life. The purpose of Grant's peace policy of 1868 was an attempt to minimize the military conflict with the Indians and to, quote, again, Americanize them. Grant promised to remove the corrupt American officials that supervised the reservations, and he replaced them with Christian missionaries. There were also several Supreme Court rulings that limited the rights of Native Americans. The most notable one being Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, which gave Congress the power to make any Native American policy that it wanted.